Story 1. Story 1, The Auditorium. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous B-flat above Mrs. Henderson's droning voice. History. Always history. The dusty scent of chalk and old textbooks hung heavy in the air, suffocating me more than usual. I traced the outline of a knight on the cover of my textbook, my mind adrift in the static hum of afternoon apathy. Just another Tuesday at Northwood High. Then, the bell rang. Not the jarring, electronic clang that usually signaled the end of class, but a long, low, resonant tone. It vibrated through the floorboards, up my spine, and into the hollow of my skull. "That's odd," Mrs. Henderson muttered, adjusting her glasses. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, was thin, uncertain. The other students exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved. The bell continued, its resonance growing, filling the room with a palpable pressure. It felt less like a sound and more like a physical force. "Everyone, remain calm," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice strained. But her words were swallowed by the deepening drone of the bell. It felt as if the very walls of the classroom were vibrating. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bell ceased. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the frantic thump of my own pulse. "Okay," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice shaky. Let's just head to the auditorium for the assembly." Assembly? There wasn't an assembly scheduled. But no one questioned her. We filed out of the classroom, a silent, bewildered herd. The hallway, normally buzzing with chatter and laughter, was eerily quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic tap of our shoes on the linoleum floor. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen energy. The familiar, institutional smell of the hallway was replaced by something else. Something metallic and sweet, like overripe fruit. It made my stomach churn. We reached the auditorium doors. They were massive, oak doors, usually locked tight except for special occasions. Now, they were slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. Hesitantly, Mrs. Henderson pushed them open. The auditorium was dark. Completely dark. Not the dimness of a darkened theater, but an absolute, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow all light. The unsettling fragrance intensified, thick and cloying. "Hello?" Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice small and lost in the vastness. No response. A few students edged inside, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated. A primal fear, cold and sharp, gripped my chest. I didn't want to go in there. But the silent pressure from the students behind me pushed me forward. I stumbled into the darkness, blindly following the others. The air was heavy, stagnant. I could hear the nervous breathing of my classmates around me, the shuffle of their feet on the carpet. Then, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome," it whispered. "We've been waiting." My breath hitched in my throat. I reached out, blindly grasping for something, anything, to anchor myself. My hand brushed against something cold and smooth. Metal. A railing. We were on the stage. I could feel the worn wooden planks beneath my feet. Where are the lights?" a voice whispered from the darkness. Another whisper, closer this time, right beside my ear. "There are no lights." A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped. Suddenly, a single spotlight flickered on. It shone directly on the center of the stage, illuminating a small, wooden podium. And behind it, a figure. Tall and slender, cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, only the vague outline of a human form. The figure raised a hand. A long, thin hand, bone-white again. Its voice was a low, resonant hum, similar to the tone of the bell. "The performance is about to begin." Another spotlight snapped on, illuminating the first row of seats in the auditorium. Empty. except for one figure sitting in the center. Mr. Davis, our principal. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring straight ahead. His face was pale, almost translucent. Then, another spotlight. Another empty row. Except for one figure. Mrs. Johnson, the school librarian. Her expression was the same as Mr. Davis's, vacant, lifeless. Spotlight after spotlight flickered on, revealing more and more figures. Teachers, staff, students. All seated, silent, staring. Their faces were masks of blank, unseeing horror. The metallic scent intensified, almost overwhelming. It was coming from the stage. From the figure. I looked down. My hand was still gripping the railing. But the metal felt different. Soft. Yielding. I pulled my hand back. It was coated in a thick, viscous substance. Red. The figure at the podium began to speak. Its voice was low, hypnotic, weaving its way into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. I couldn't understand the words, but they resonated deep within me, stirring a primal fear I didn't know I possessed. The figure raised its hand again, and the spotlight on the podium dimmed, plunging the auditorium back into darkness. The only light came from the spotlights on the silent, staring figures in the seats. Then, the whispers began again, all around me, closing in. "Welcome," they whispered. "The performance has begun." I stood there, frozen, paralyzed by terror. The metallic smell, the whispers, the staring eyes, it was all too much. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. And then, silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. The spotlights remained, illuminating the rows of vacant faces. The figure was gone. I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to cease to exist. The only reality was the oppressive silence, the staring eyes, and the growing dread that clawed at my insides. Finally, dawn broke, filtering through the high windows of the auditorium, painting the silent figures in a ghostly, ethereal light. The metallic smell had faded, replaced by the familiar mustiness of the old building. The whispers were gone. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away from the stage, my eyes fixed on the silent figures. I reached the doors, pushed them open, and stumbled out into the hallway. The school was empty. Silent. Deserted. As if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I knew it. I could feel it in the hollow ache in my chest, in the lingering dread that clung to me like a shroud. I walked home, alone, through the empty streets. The sun shone brightly, the birds sang, but the world felt different. Wrong. As if I was walking through a dream, a distorted reflection of reality. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the performance wasn't over. It had just begun. Story 2. Story 2, The Auditorium. The fluorescent lights of Northwood High's auditorium buzzed, a monotonous drone that usually faded into background noise. But not today. Today, the hum vibrated in my teeth, each flicker a tiny hammer blow against the fragile shell of my composure. Rehearsals for the fall play, Our Town, were supposed to be a refuge, a place where I could disappear into Emily Webb's naive optimism. Instead, I felt exposed, like a specimen pinned under glass. "Sarah? You okay?" Mrs. Davies, our drama teacher, peered at me over her half-moon spectacles. Her voice, usually warm and encouraging, felt sharp, intrusive. "Yeah, fine," I mumbled, clutching my script. The paper felt thin, flimsy, no protection against the oppressive silence that had fallen over the auditorium. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed with something expectant. It started subtly. A faint, metallic scent, like old blood. Then, the temperature dropped, a sudden chill that raised goosebumps on my arms despite the stifling heat of the auditorium. I glanced around, searching the shadowy recesses of the balcony, the empty seats stretching out like rows of tombstones. "Okay, let's run Act 2, Scene 1 from the top," Mrs. Davies announced, clapping her hands. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the high ceiling and disappearing into the velvet curtains. As we ran through the scene, a strange disquiet settled over the cast. Lines were forgotten, cues missed. Even Jason, our star quarterback who played George Gibbs, stumbled over his words, his face pale and drawn. "Cut, cut, cut!" Mrs. Davies sighed, rubbing her temples. "What's going on with everyone today?" Nobody answered. We all felt it. The oppressive weight of something unseen, something wrong. After rehearsal, I lingered, unwilling to face the echoing emptiness of the hallways. The janitor, Mr. Henderson, a stooped figure I'd barely registered before, shuffled past, pushing a squeaking mop bucket. His eyes, dark and hollow, met mine for a fleeting moment, and a shiver ran down my spine. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He just kept moving, swallowed by the shadows. Alone in the auditorium, the buzzing lights seemed to intensify, the hum morphing into a low, guttural growl. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, a primal instinct screaming at me to run. I gathered my things, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I reached the double doors, I heard it. A whisper, soft as a breath against my ear. My name. Sarah. I froze, every muscle tense. I turned slowly, my eye scanning the darkened auditorium. Empty. The stage was bare, the chairs vacant, the curtains still. But the whisper lingered, a ghostly echo in the vast, silent space. Sarah. It was closer now, coming from behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The doors were closed. I hadn't heard them shut. I fumbled for the handle, my fingers slick with sweat. It wouldn't turn. Locked. Panic clawed at my throat. I rattled the handle, pounding on the heavy wood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then, a low chuckle, echoing from the balcony above. It wasn't human. It was something cold, something ancient, something that reveled in my fear. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The chuckle faded, replaced by the buzzing of the lights, the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet, the creaking of the old wooden stage. Ordinary sounds, yet they felt distorted, sinister. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the auditorium into near darkness. A single spotlight flicked on, illuminating the center of the stage. And there, standing in the pool of light, was Mr. Henderson. He wasn't stooped anymore. He stood tall, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. He held a mop in his hand, but it wasn't a mop. It was a scythe. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that stretched his lips into a grotesque parody of human expression. "You shouldn't have stayed so late, Sarah," he whispered, his voice no longer the frail rasp of an old man, but something deep, resonant, and filled with an unbearable malice. The auditorium, it hungers. The lights went out. I screamed, a desperate, animalistic sound that was swallowed by the darkness. The metallic scent of blood grew stronger, filling my nostrils, choking me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by terror. When the lights flickered back on, Mr. Henderson was gone. The scythe was gone. The auditorium was empty. The doors were unlocked. I stumbled out into the hallway, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. The world outside felt unreal, a flimsy backdrop to the horror I had just experienced. I never went back to the auditorium. I dropped out of the play, avoided Mrs. Davies, and never spoke to Mr. Henderson again. But I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting, lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The whisper. My name. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out? What does the auditorium hunger for? And is it still waiting for me? Story 3. Story 3, The Auditorium. The fluorescent lights of Northwood High's auditorium hummed, a monotonous drone that usually faded into background noise. Not today. Today, the hum vibrated through me, a physical tremor that mirrored the unease churning in my stomach. Rehearsals for the school play, Our Town, were supposed to be a welcome escape from the pressures of junior year. Now, they felt like a prelude to something else. "Sarah, you okay?" Miss Klein, our drama teacher, peered at me with concern. Her usually bright eye seemed shadowed, tired. "Yeah, just a headache," I mumbled, clutching my script. The paper felt damp, like my palms. "Take a break. We'll run Act 2 in 10. I nodded, grateful for the reprieve. The auditorium was nearly empty. Most of the cast were in the cafeteria, grabbing a late lunch. The vast, empty space, usually buzzing with activity, felt oppressive, suffocating. I retreated to the back row, seeking solace in the shadows. The headache throbbed behind my eyes, a steady pulse that seemed to synchronize with the humming lights. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the rising panic. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone sighing right next to me. I jerked my head around, heart hammering. Empty seats. Shadows. Nothing. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, but the auditorium was sealed tight. There were no open windows. The whispers continued, intermittent, elusive. Sometimes, they sounded close, other times, distant, echoing from the stage. I couldn't make out any words, just a breathy, rustling sound that scraped against my nerves. I tried to focus on my script, but the words swam before my eyes, meaningless symbols on a page. The auditorium felt colder now, a chilling draft swirling around my ankles. I glanced towards the stage. The heavy velvet curtain seemed to shift, to breathe, as if something were hiding behind them. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Chloe, my best friend, "Where are you?" "Rehearsal's starting." I typed back quickly, "Back row." "Something's weird." "Weird how?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain the growing sense of dread, the whispers, the chilling air. "I'll tell you later," I typed, and shoved the phone back in my pocket. As I stood up, a heavy thud echoed from the stage. A spotlight flickered on, bathing the center of the stage in a harsh, white light. I squinted, trying to see through the glare. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow. My breath hitched. It looked like Miss Klein? But something was off. Her posture was rigid, unnatural. She didn't move, just stood there, bathed in the spotlight. "Miss Klein?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Slowly, the figure began to turn. The shadows shifted, revealing, not Miss Klein. It was a girl, maybe my age, dressed in a long, white gown. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could see her long, dark hair cascading down her back. Terror seized me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The girl tilted her head, as if listening. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, louder now, almost intelligible. "Sarah. My name." Whispered on the wind, carried on the breath of something not human. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The clatter broke the spell. The girl on the stage vanished. The spotlight clicked off, plunging the auditorium back into semi-darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. I stood there, paralyzed, heart pounding against my ribs. The auditorium was empty, silent, normal. Had I imagined it? Was it the stress, the headache? Then, I saw it. Lying center stage, bathed in the faint glow of the emergency exit lights, was a single, white rose. Identical to the ones we used as props in Our Town. But these roses were artificial. This one was real, its petals velvety soft, its scent heavy and sweet, tinged with something metallic. My phone buzzed again. It was Chloe. "Sarah? You okay? Miss Klein's looking for you. Said you disappeared." I stared at the rose, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Miss Klein hadn't been looking for me. I'd seen her, hadn't I? Or had I seen something else? I didn't respond to Chloe's text. I turned and fled the auditorium, the heavy scent of roses clinging to me like a shroud. I haven't been back since. The play was cancelled. No one talks about what happened that day. Ms. Klein moved away at the end of the school year. No explanation was given. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my room, I hear the whispers again. Faint, elusive, like the rustling of silk. And I wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed? What if I'd stepped onto the stage, reached out, and touched the rose? The thought chills me to the bone, a fear that lingers, a question that haunts me still.